The title is The Late Blooming Novelist, Navigating the World of Publication. And the title of his book, his latest book, is Abandon All Hope. Just tell you a little bit about him. He's a writer, translator, a nomad at heart. He was born in India. He has since enjoyed a transatlantic life living in the United States, Argentina, Great Britain, the Czech Republic, and Russia. He studied linguistics and Slavic languages at the University of Chicago, St. Andrews, and Oxford, and works as a translator from Russian and German into English. Currently, he lives just north of Chicago in charming and bucolic Lake Bluff, a few minutes walk from Lake Michigan. As a writer, he has extensive publication record, which includes academic articles on linguistics, as well as articles on such diverse subjects as the Czech beer industry, the new urbanist movement in America, minority languages in Russia, and many others. His literary side is manifested in numerous book reviews and short stories, and Abandon All Hope is his first novel. And we have somebody in our audience who said to me, she wants to be a writer, and that's the main reason she came. So welcome, Scott, and we're looking forward to this.
Okay, so thank you all for coming, and I'd like to say a big hello to all of you out in Zoom land. This is the first time I'm doing this, so please bear with me. I do have to apologize for a slight mix-up in the title of the presentation. It wasn't clear until quite recently, but I think the content of it is clear. I'm going to talk about a few things. I'm going to talk about how to get your book, in my case, a novel, published if you don't have an agent. And in order to do this, I'm going to sketch out how the publishing world works nowadays. And I will also describe my own strategy for submitting and promoting my novel in view of the obstacles that unknown writers face. And at the end, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the novel itself and how I went about writing it. And if that piques your interest sufficiently, there will be copies of the novel for sale. You'll get a 10% discount if you buy it here. But you'll notice that the title that I've got here is The Late Blooming Novelist. And I gave it that title for a reason. And that's basically because you can be a published writer, become a published writer at pretty much any age. Now, some forms of art require you to start becoming proficient in them very young and practice constantly, such as ballet dancing, any type of music. If you want to be a violin virtuoso, you have to start very early. In that respect, this sort of art form has a lot in common with sports, where you also have to start early. And some art forms require you to invest in a lot of expensive equipment. Cinema is perhaps the most obvious example, also certain forms of visual art, painting and the like. But writing is something you can do at any time of life, and the equipment that you need for it is often fairly simple or standard. In the old days, you needed your paper and a pen or a typewriter. And nowadays, you need a computer. And what this means is that if you can become a writer at any age in life, it is true that quite a few people have really begun making an impact only when they've been in middle age or older. And there are a number of historical examples I could bring out here. a good one is Miguel de Cervantes, who wrote Don Quixote when he was 58, and the second part of it after the age of 60, the book that really made him famous. And I think we can also assume that 58 was a lot older in the 17th century than it is today. I could also mention the 19th century novelist Theodore Fontana, who published his first novel at 57, which coincidentally is the age I happen to be right now. There's the Portuguese Nobel Prize winner José Saramago, who became known when he was about 60. The travel writer Patrick Leigh Fermor wrote his major book, A Time of Gifts, when he was, I think, 62. So in other words, late blooming writers are not that unusual. And a lot of people, have told me, when I retire and I get some time to myself, I want to write a book and hopefully get it published. The problem is, often when you find yourself in that situation, you don't know how to go about it. Okay, now I'm going to write the book, or you can write the book, but what happens next? How do you get it out in the world? How do you break through into publication? And it is true that breaking into the world of publication can be extremely difficult. And what further complicates this fact is that, at least when we're talking about fiction, the quality of your work is really not that important a factor. In many cases, it may not be a factor at all. Plenty of good books don't get published. Plenty of bad books do get published. I realize it's a subjective judgment here, but I think a lot of people would agree with me. Many people think I've written a good book. That should be sufficient to get it published. Well, I'm sorry, but that's not true. And while there are many examples I can cite, I'm going to mention one in particular that has become somewhat notorious. In 1969, Jerzy Kosinski's novel Steps, which I show up here, won the National Book Award for fiction. It's one of the highest honors that a novel can receive. In 1977, which is, say, only 8 years after the book was published, there was a freelance writer named Chuck Ross who wanted to demonstrate how difficult it was for unknown writers to break into the publishing world. So he decided to conduct an experiment. He typed out the entire manuscript of Steps. He changed the title and he changed the author's name. And then he started sending it out to publishing houses. He sent it out to 10 publishers in all. Okay, does anyone want to take a guess and tell me how many of those publishers accepted the book? You're right, none of them accepted it. And perhaps the most shocking of all, one of the houses that rejected it, Random House, was the firm that had published it in the first place. And I want to read an entertaining little tidbit for you. This is from Houghton Mifflin. They wrote to Ross a rejection letter that included this gem of a comment. Several of us read your novel here with admiration for writing and style. Jerzy Kosinski comes to mind as a point of comparison while reading the stark, chilly episodic incidents you have set down. The drawback of the manuscript, as it stands, is that it doesn't add up to a satisfactory whole. It has some very impressive moments, but gives the impression of sketchiness and incompleteness. Well, that's a good question, and I don't have the answer to that, but it's the crazy thing that, this was a well-known book, supposedly, and nobody thought to check up on it. I think nowadays that probably wouldn't happen because of computerization, but in the 1970s, you could probably get away with an experiment like this more easily. And to make things even crazier, Chuck Ross sent query letters out to 26 agents, and all of them turned him down. So I hope this isn't depressing because it's going to get better as I go along. But yeah, first you might object that this novel Steps was a piece of literary avant-garde. It's intended for a niche audience and lacking in commercial potential. But the fact is that even hugely successful commercial authors have had their own struggles in getting on the publishing map. And good luck is often the key to success. And I'll give you a couple of examples here. The first Harry Potter book was rejected by 12 different publishers. And why did it get accepted by the 13th? Because the editor to whom J.K. Rowling sent it left it out on the table, and his 8-year-old daughter read it and said, "Hey, Dad, this is really good." So, having taken his daughter's advice, the book was accepted. Another example, Stephen King's first novel is Carrie. He sent this out 30 times. It was rejected 30 times before it scored a hit. Doubleday decided to take a chance on it. But he only got to the rejection stage because his wife rescued the manuscript from the garbage. King had become so upset and frustrated by the process of rejection that he threw the whole thing in the trash. And she fished it out and insisted that he, keep trying to get it accepted. And as we know, this ended happily for him. Now, so there's a strong element of luck here, but as we all know, books do get accepted and published all the time. Somehow it happens. And it even happens to new authors sometimes who don't necessarily have a lot of connections in the publishing industry. So let's look first at how the publishing world is put together. There's basically, if you're an author, there's basically 3 options for you. Now, on the left, you'll see there's the big 4, which are conglomerates. There's Penguin Random House, Hachette Book Group, Macmillan, and HarperCollins. They used to be the big 5 until last year, but Simon & Schuster was acquired by Penguin Random House, so it's back to big 4. These are the 4 conglomerates that control major publishing in the United States and probably the English-speaking world as a whole. But if you're a new author, here's the takeaway for you. Forget about them. That's because they will not even look at your manuscript unless it comes from an agent, preferably a reputable agent with lots of good connections, somebody they've worked with before. Since agentless authors are automatically locked out of the big 4, we will go straight to the other options. So essentially there's 2 options. There's small press or self-publishing. And even here, there's certain nuances that you have to be aware of. So let's look at self-publishing first. Now, self-publishing has a long and honorable history. A lot of famous authors have done it. Either they couldn't get published by a standard publisher, or if they had some other reason. If you're willing to put in the work, it can be a good way to get your work out in the world. As Edgar Allan Poe, Walt Whitman, Virginia Woolf, 3 famous examples I put up there. They all publish their own work. The other thing is, nowadays it's easier than ever. There's various platforms available to do it. Amazon has its own. There are many different others. Advantages of self-publishing are several. You own all the rights. You don't, sell them away to a publishing house. You design the cover. You set the price. You get all the profits because there's no publishing company that has to take the majority of the cut. You get basically 100% of royalties, which is a sweet deal. If you are really good at marketing, you can sell a lot of books. You can go on YouTube and you can find all kinds of enterprising self-publishers who will tell you how they design and sell their own books. Occasionally, a self-published novel takes off. A very strong recent example was the science fiction novel The Martian by Andy Weir. He couldn't get it published, so he decided to publish it himself. It was a huge success. He sold the film rights and, take it from there. He made a great success of it. So yes, it is possible. There are other examples I can cite. Quite a few self-publishing successes in recent years. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is those are extreme exceptions. Easy self-publishing means that the number of published books has exploded. If everyone can do it, then the number of books is just going to keep going up. And I've got a couple of statistics for you. In 2018, 1.7 million books were published in the United States. This is an increase of 264% from only 5 years previously. And it's hard to tell exactly, but the best statistics I saw indicated that around half of those are self-publishing titles. And that's only 3 years ago already. It's probably increased since then. So standing out becomes extremely difficult if you're a self-published author. So now I'm going to discuss the small press option, which is the option that I pursued. And why should you choose a small press over self-publishing? And I think it all boils down to one word, and that word is selectivity. There is no selectivity in self-publishing. You wrote the book, you decided to publish it, you published it. But any small press has to be selective. Given the number of submissions that they receive every year, they may publish only 5 books a year, and they probably got several hundred submissions during that year, from which they chose those 5 books to publish. In short, being published by a small press represents validation by an outside party. It's essentially the first step in marketing. Somebody liked your book enough to publish it. And that's not the sense of validation that you get from self-publishing. Okay, so what is the small press world? Let's take a look at it. Okay, and you'll see the cover illustration I've included what a small press looked like in the 16th century when all presses were small, but they don't look like that nowadays. So how do we define a small press or indie press? Often these terms are used interchangeably. Let's say they publish not more than about 10 titles a year. This is not a hard and fast definition. There are some publishers that call themselves small presses that publish more than that. There's a number of so-called indie presses like Milkweed Editions and Grey Wolf that might publish 20 books, but they often wind up in lists of small presses. So it's not firm. And at the other end, there's these tiny, so-called micro presses. They might publish 1 to 3 books a year, often one-person operations. Another of them might be imprints of larger presses. For example, University of Wisconsin Press, which is a big university press, runs its own fiction line. They publish a few novels a year, and they have a regional focus. So effectively, it functions like a small press. And there are actually quite a few university presses that publish fiction. This brings me to another thing, which is they have, typically, many of them have a particular focus. They publish a particular genre, which would be historical fiction, science fiction, fantasy, what have you. They publish in a particular style. They might publish something avant-garde or give preference to that. Or they might be focused on a particular region, they're based in Texas, so they publish about Texas. There's a lot of regionalism in the presses. And the small press world is a very large world. If you go to Poets and Writers magazine and you search on small presses publishing fiction, you will get 25 pages worth of small presses. There's a lot of possibilities out there. I once saw a comprehensive list of small, indie, and micro presses, and it seemed to me that there were about a couple of hundred presses that publish poetry alone. So if you're a poet, there's a lot of potential publishing venues out there for you. So now comes my own little piece of poetry right now. Just so you know, here are some of the small presses that I submitted my novel to. Black Lawrence Press, Permanent Press, Able Muse, $2 Radio, Unsolicited Press, Unnamed Press, Unbridled Press, Ice Cube Press, Coffee Town Press, Red Mountain Press, Blue Moon Press, Black Mountain Press, Black Water Press, Black Light Press, Bottom Dog Press, and Fat Dog Books. Some of these turned it down, some I never heard from, and some of them I withdrew the manuscript from after it was accepted by Octus, which is the publisher that eventually accepted me. I'll get to that. Are there any questions so far? Okay, I'll continue. Now, I mentioned that the Big Four have their requirement that you have to have an agent before they'll even look at you. Well, the sad fact is small presses themselves, they often have their own requirements and obstacles. And here are some of the most common. One is you can only submit during a certain time of the year. So like they'll say, okay, we only look at manuscripts January, February, March, and then we're closed to submissions for the rest of the year. We decide, while we decide what books we're going to publish. So if you missed that cutoff point, you can't submit to them that year. Or they may say you can only submit on the afternoon of October 23rd between the hours of 1 and 5 p.m. Okay, I made that one up, but things seem to be going in that direction because, as I said earlier, they are flooded with submissions. Beyond this, they might have other requirements. One of them now is that you can only submit your novel as part of a competition. So they'll run a competition for novel writing, say, and they'll select 2 winners and they will publish them, and that is their novel publication program for the year. And typically you have to pay a fee to enter the competition. Not huge. Usually it's something like, in the range of $15 to $30. And that brings me to another point, which is outside of competitions, it's become increasingly common for small presses to charge a fee just to submit your work. Usually this is a small fee. It's in the range of $5 to $10 in my experience. There were some presses demanding as high as $25, but I wasn't willing to go that high. Again, you have to decide how high you're willing to go, really, to get them to look at your book. One publisher to which I submitted my manuscript required you to buy one of their books at a discounted price. And mine was $12. I was okay with that, but I'm glad that they were the only press who required me to do that. Otherwise, I'd have like a big stack of books that I didn't really want. Now, if this sounds rather onerous, let's bear in mind that most submissions nowadays are made electronically. In the old days, you had to put it in the post with a self-addressed stamped envelope if you wanted to get your rejected manuscript back. All of this costs money. So from that point of view, the reading fees they charge seem to me fairly reasonable. Either way, you have to pay. And personally, I'd rather pay to subsidize the small presses rather than pay the post office. So I'm not really objecting to it. There's also the way by which you submit has changed. Now it tends to be electronic. Of all the submissions I made, only one was done the old-fashioned way, putting it in a big envelope and sending it through the mail, and all the others were made electronically, either by email, writing to an editor, publishing house, or by using a special submission platform. There are a number of these. The most commonly used appears to be Submittable, which allows you to keep track of your submissions and makes it possible to pay whatever fee is required. So you just set up your Submittable account and you submit your manuscripts that way. Nice and easy. Now, I'm going to come to, let's describe the submission process in a little more detail. I'm going to come to a very important point now. Follow every submission rule as strictly as you can. And beyond that, your query letter and your manuscript must be free of any typographical, grammatical, or formatting error. It's important to keep in mind that they, the editors, are looking for reasons to reject you from the get-go. And why is that? It's because, as I already stated, they are flooded with submissions. And let me try to personalize this a little. Imagine that you are an editor at a publishing house. Every day, you might get dozens of manuscripts in your inbox from writers you've never heard of, whose work you've never asked to see, requesting publication of their manuscript. Let's say you go to lunch. When you come back from lunch, there are 6 more submissions in your inbox waiting to be processed. You might get hundreds of submissions in a month, or sometimes even in a week. So how do you handle this constant onslaught of submissions? There are a number of strategies that you look at. One is, the first thing you do is check whether this is the right kind of book for your publishing house. If you're a publisher based in Houston, and if you specialize on Texas-related subjects, the novel set in New York City, or even in Arizona or New Mexico, is not going to be of interest to you. You have a niche and you want to follow it. It doesn't matter how good it is. It doesn't fit your brand. And that's reason enough to reject it. If your field is mystery and detective novels, you're not even going to look at that science fiction novel, no matter how good it is. I made this mistake once. I sent my novel to a company that specialized in, I think, Appalachian literature. Don't ask me why I did that. It was an oversight on my part. 5 minutes later, I got a message from the publisher saying, "Scott, I commend you, but that is not the kind of book we publish." At least he responded. Most editors won't because they're too busy. The second stage of elimination that the editors go through is a brief check of the written quality of the submission. And this goes beyond mere errors and gets into the style and how well you know what you're doing as an author. So let's say you look at the query letter and the first sentence says, "Please find attached the first chapter of my fiction novel." Okay, terminology like this is going to get you rejected right off the bat because there's no such thing as a nonfiction novel. So hence using a term like fiction novel sort of broadcasts that you don't really know what you're doing. It's an immediate disqualifier. Now, more obviously, typos, grammatical errors, any sort of awkward writing, it just gives them an instant reason to trash your submission. So let's say the manuscript passes these initial hurdles, and you can now get down to reading it. If you read the first paragraph or the first page and it grabs you, then it tells you that this is something that you can consider, which, as a writer, this is why it's very important to write a really gripping first page or even first paragraph or sentence. The majority of submissions will not pass these tests. Some editors have their own quirky way of evaluating manuscripts, like one that I've read of goes immediately to page 117 and see if there's anything interesting on that page. They develop these techniques because they have to weed out, what is considered unsuitable for the publishing house. So let's say that you've passed these tests. As a writer, you did your homework on the publisher and you determined that it was a good fit for your novel. Let's also stipulate that you followed the submission rules flawlessly, and as a result, you got the editors to take you and your book seriously. Now, I'm going to look at what I think is the single most important part of your submission, which is the query letter. What is a query letter? Well, it's basically a pitch, a brief, punchy letter where you explain why the publisher should publish your book. Now, the goal is to snag the attention of the editors and get them to consider your manuscript. And when they request the entire manuscript from you, you go from unsolicited to solicited. That's exactly where you want to be. You've already risen above the crowd by getting them interested in asking for your manuscript. So we're going to go through the essential elements of the query letter, and then I'm going to show you an actual example and show you how the elements are embedded in it. And the example that I'm going to show you is going to be my own query letter because it was highly successful. I got, I think, 5 solicitations off this query letter. In one case, I got a response asking for the manuscript within 30 minutes after I'd sent the query letter. In another case, I had to wait a couple of days. And so it was a query letter that worked really well for me. So we're going to analyze it right here. But there are basically 4 components of the query letter that you have to follow. One, you should personalize it, meaning you should address it to a specific person and don't write, "Dear editor, dear name of publisher." There's what we call housekeeping, which is presenting relevant information about your book, the genre, the word count, the title. There's what we can call the hook, which is a catchy description of the book, which tells you quickly, what the book is about, and often you include references to other titles, successful titles that are similar. And then finally, there's the biographical section, who you are, and writing credits, if you have any of them. That should go in that last section. And the whole thing, really, you should be able to wrap it up in 3 paragraphs, because remember, these are busy people and they want you to be as concise as possible. So let's look at my query letter, paragraph by paragraph. Okay, so here's the first paragraph of the letter. Dear name of person, as I said, it has to be an actual person's name. Now, I'm giving, first, when you write a question like this at the beginning, it's a good way of snagging the attention. How do you make your way in a world in which fraud and lies are ubiquitous, stability is illusory, and happiness is always elusive? That is the question faced by the heroes of my novel, Abandon All Hope. So there's the title. Some brief information about the story. It is a story in which the 2 protagonists, one a cynical corporate drone and the other an idealistic college dropout, embody contrasting approaches to life. So we know something about the plot right there. The novel is a work of literary fiction. I tell you what the genre is. It's not science fiction, it's not romance. I give you a word count, so you know how long it is, approximately. And a little bit of a sting in the tail here. It provides philosophical elements with comedy. It contains scenes of workplace and satire. So I've addressed it to a person, and I've done what we call the housekeeping. And now we have the hook. And this is where I get into a bit more detail about the novel itself. I tell you when and where it is set in the Chicago area in the 1990s. Now I mention works that are similar to it. The novels that I listed, Fight Club and High Fidelity, and why it is similar to these, have the advantage of, they were both highly successful novels that became highly successful movies. So that's a plus point too. I mentioned a couple of other works that are quite similar. Office Space, which isn't a novel, but is actually a cult film that's very popular, which the workplace satire relates to that. So that should grab the attention. Another piece of workplace satire, Then We Came to the End, which I personally did not like very much as a novel, but who cares? It was successful. Then I tell about who are my readers? Who am I expecting to read this book? I say that it's aimed at an audience that appreciates a lightly satirical and philosophical take on the modern world of work and the pressures that contemporary urban and suburban life exert on us. So I've got an audience in mind. That helps the publisher. And this last sentence was one that were, you could say, history intruded upon me and forced me to put it down. It was not in the original version of the query letter, but I managed to relate it to COVID, even though it takes place in the 1990s. Some of the themes of the book resonate in our age of disease. And that was just a case of taking advantage of the historical moment. And now we come to the third and final paragraph. This is about me. I tell them I'm a writer, that I have an extensive publication record. That's going to get their attention. With fiction and nonfiction, I tell people where some of my work has appeared. And if I had to select one thing which probably got their attention more than anything else, it's this sentence here. In 2016, my short story Everest was the second prize winner in somebody's annual fiction contest. So they're going to take note of this. So if you have some writing credits already, especially anything that looks like a prize or any sort of prominent publishing venue that you've appeared in, definitely want to put that in your query letter. And then we sign off. I've got a website and blog, so I link to that at the bottom of the message. And I sign off. I give all my contact information to make it really easy to contact me. You're, in a certain sense, you're kind of doing their work for them. You are convincing them to take an interest in your work. And so you have to make it easy for them to find out about you. I think I'd like to sum up now. I've boiled down this presentation really into what I call the 5 basic principles. Number one is make sure the publisher is a good fit for your book. I've discussed this already. Don't submit a science fiction novel to a romance publisher or vice versa. Number 2, follow every submission rule as strictly as possible. As I said, the reason is they get many more submissions than they can handle, than they can deal with. They are looking for reasons to reject you right off the bat. So don't give them those reasons. Principle number 3, write a great query letter. And so we just went through that. I think the query letter is probably your most important thing, assuming there are no typos or other things. It's your chance to really pitch the book and make it sound great to the publisher. So make sure that the query letter really shines. And then there's final 2 principles that I have not really, I'm going to dwell on them a little bit. Finding the right publisher means that you keep submitting in the face of rejection, because rejection is the name of the game when you're a writer. It's important not to get discouraged, because it's not necessarily that they didn't like what you said to them. There could be many reasons why you got turned down. Some writers, who are just starting out, make it a goal to get 100 rejections per year. That's because if you get that many rejections, you're going to get some hits too, and you're going to build on those hits. And you have got to get your work out there and consistently. I've seen too many people say, "Oh, it got turned down 3 times. That means it's no good." Not at all. That's not what it means. If you've got to constantly be sending out your work, and persistence pays off. And the second element, or 5th element, which is related to this, to persistence, is of course luck. I don't think I have to expand on this too much, because persistence relates to it. Being persistent is an element in creating your own luck. If you have your manuscript out at 25 different publishers, as opposed to 3 different publishers, you're more likely to get lucky. And I do want to, I realize I haven't given you any statistics from my own submission journey, so I'll tell you now. I don't know exactly how many times I submitted, but I think it was about 30. I got rejected, I think, 14 times. And the reason why, for the discrepancy between the two numbers, is that I was submitting simultaneously. Now, sometimes they say you're not supposed to do this, but in reality, everybody does, because realistically, you can't have someone sitting on your book for 6 months while you wait for a response and then send it to the next person. I've been in writers groups where the general belief is, what is the chance that 2 publishers are going to accept it on the same day? 0, right? Or almost 0. And that's what I always thought. But then a crazy thing happened. At the end of March of this year, Alctus Publishers, which is a small press based in Philadelphia, accepted my book. At that time, I had it out to about 20 other presses also. So it was now my responsibility to write to those presses and withdraw the book from their consideration. Well, while I was doing this, one of those other presses also accepted the book. This is never supposed to happen. I mean, I was amazed, but I wrote to them explaining the situation, and they were cool with it. So that's what happened. The book was accepted at the end of March. It was published at the end of September. Publisher has been great. I think they made a nice, a nice package of it. It's good looking. The front cover photo was taken by a photographer from Glenview, who's a longstanding friend of mine, and now it's out and it's available. And so I think I'll wrap it up. So does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, by the way, I enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you.
Very, very much. Do you get an opportunity to negotiate with the publishers concerning any issues that you have?
Well, yeah, I remember when he sent me the book contract, there were certain things that I had to stipulate with regard to rights, or rather that I had to check to make sure that everything was okay, because I'd never signed a book contract before. And I do realize that sometimes, publishers can rip off authors in certain ways. So I tried to do my homework on that. I made sure that, for example, I retained the rights to adaptation, to say film, TV, radio, and what have you. And that I'm just lending him the rights to sell the book. I remain the copyright owner. I mean, that's one of the things that you have to check. And so my advice is, if you reach the stage where they are sending you a contract, check it very carefully. If you have serious doubts, you might want to consult a lawyer who specializes in intellectual property or that sort of related field. I didn't deem it necessary because I think the contract was pretty clear.
Can you tell us a little bit about your own book?
Yeah, sure. I think you might have picked up a little about that from the query letter. I actually wrote the book. I started writing it very long ago in 2002. And the reason I started writing it was because I had a lot of work experience that I thought would serve as good material for a novel, specifically a workplace satire. So I started writing based on this material. I devised my main characters and I wrote some episodes, but I didn't have a plot or a central theme at that point. I just set it aside. Then real life intervened, and I basically forgot about it. But then when I won second prize in that fiction contest, I decided to revisit some of my old projects. I looked at the material I had created and I decided to finish it. And I thought it would be interesting to use contrasting protagonists. One of my characters being a realist or cynic, and the other being more idealistic, and how they go through life. And I sat down and I committed to writing more or less 500 words a day. And this was late 2019. And by early 2020, just before COVID hit, the book, or the first draft of it, was finished. I did some revisions later, but it was basically finished by February or March 2020. And it's a workplace satire, but it's also a novel of ideas, like a dealing with issues of what should you do with your life, really? How should you approach it? It's a Chicago novel, and it's also kind of a period piece now, because it's set in 1998. And when I started writing it in 2002, that was just the recent past, but and so much time passed, and now we can take a kind of an ironic, satirical journey back to the 90s, because things look rather different now than they did then. And so I view it as basically a comic novel, but I'm going to tell you about an interesting split that I'm noticing among the readers so far. Basically, some people agree with me, yeah, this is a comic novel, it's funny, it has some occasionally dark elements, but then a lot of comedy does. But then a couple of people I know and respect who have read it say, oh, this is such a tragic and depressing book. And I thought, that's remarkable. I mean, I think it's remarkable that it can polarize the readership in that way. I think it would be, for that reason, I think it would be a fun book to discuss in a book club or something like that. So that's, basically so I wrote a comic novel, and some people think it's a tragic novel.
First of all, I want to thank you very much. It's very interesting. As I had told you before, I've been a writer all my life, journalist, and I have written short stories. I've written poetry. I've won an award for one poem that I wrote, and some of this stuff has been published in short stories and so forth. But I've written a book of poetry, and it isn't finished yet. I have a couple more I should add to it. But there's a different approach, I would think, for poetry than there would be for a novel. And I just want to ask you what you think.
Fundamentally, I agree with you. However, I can't really get into the difference because I don't know enough about the submission process. I have friends who have published poetry, and occasionally I've looked at submission rules. And for example, to magazines, they'll say, send us five poems, and it's more like submitting short stories, which is generally submitting to magazines. If you want to get a book published, whether it's a chapbook, a small one, or a complete one, there are presses that specialize in that, and there are a lot of them. I, however, can't really give you any specific advice on it because I never tried to do it myself. But yeah, there's a lot of poetry presses out there. That's worth pointing out. Poets and writers, yes, that was the first place I looked for small presses, and it was probably my best overall source. And you can get, just go on the internet and use their search engine. They'll allow you to search for poetry presses, literary presses, nonfiction, what have you. And you'll get a lot of results.
Let's see what chat. I don't see any actual questions.
I see a question. Any tips for marketing through the publisher or other sources? Yeah, so I'd like to address that. The fact is nowadays, one thing I forgot to say about small presses is they don't have a lot of money and they don't have a lot of resources and staff. And what does that mean for you as an author? It means that they expect you as the author to do a lot of the marketing yourself, which could take the form of social media campaigns, could involve you going on tours if you're able to fit that into your schedule, because they're not going to pay you to do that. Or it could involve things like presentations like what I'm doing now. It could also involve you as the author and maybe they helping you to query, to get book reviews from websites, bloggers, print media, and so on. That's a whole huge topic in itself, and I'm just embarking on it. But I'm doing it myself with some help, both from the publisher and from an actual publicist. So basically, if you get published by a small press, you're going to have to contribute to marketing, and some of them even want you to present your marketing plan at the time you submit. I think that's becoming increasingly common.
How long does it typically take to know if you've been accepted or rejected?
Well, that can vary enormously. You can get rejected very, very quickly, like in a day, or it could take months, or they could just forget about you. At which point, say a year down the line, you might as well accept that you've been rejected, sort of rejected by neglect, you could say. And after a certain period of time, it's okay to query them and ask them about the status of your manuscript. With acceptance, I think it's a little clearer, which is if it's not accepted fairly quickly, then acceptance is going to be unlikely. I'm not going to say impossible, but it's less likely. My book was accepted within a couple of weeks of querying, which means they liked it enough to commit to it very early. Oftentimes, you'll hear acceptance will be within a few weeks, within a month or two. I very rarely heard of cases of a book being accepted after it's been sitting at the publisher for 6 months. If it's that long, then you can assume it's been rejected or they've forgotten about it. So yeah, that's again no hard and fast rules here, but I think those are the general tendencies.
And finally, what general topics seem to attract the most attention? Non-fiction or fiction? What gatekeepers? What categories seem to have a better chance of being selected?
Discussing fiction versus nonfiction is very difficult to point out popularity because these are two huge areas and you really have to break it down within those categories to see what's popular. But there are two different worlds and they require two different approaches. Dealing with fiction, it seems to me that the vast majority of novels that are published basically fall into 4 categories, more or less. There's science fiction and fantasy, romance, crime, detective, mystery, which I'm treating as one thing, and what is called nowadays YA, which stands for young adults. And it seems, if I had to put a number on it, I'd say this is well over 90% of novels are accounted for by these groups. And then we have literary fiction, which is basically anything that you can't easily assign to a genre, I would say. So I would classify my own book as literary fiction, and it doesn't attract the most attention, but occasionally, a literary novel does take off. But I do think it's these popular genres that get the most attention, the most publication, and if you're looking to be financially successful as a writer, this is generally what you should go with.
Well, thank you very much. Really interesting presentation. And I think with that, we read our Zoom presentation.